So it's a pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker to you. Dr. Sarah Lane Ritchie came from Michigan originally, where she did a BA in philosophy and religion before doing a master's in divinity at Princeton, moving to Edinburgh, completing an MSc there, and then went on to do a PhD, the title of which was With God in Mind, Divine Action and the Naturalization of Consciousness, which you can see is related to today's topic. We have an expert talking to us. She then moved for a spell at St Andrews University before now going back to Edinburgh again, where she's at New College. And her work is on the intersection of science and theology, and particularly concerns questions surrounding the human mind and the relationship between God and the physical world. And her talk today is on With God in Mind, Integrated Physicality, Unbelief and Spiritual Technologies. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you very much. I am delighted and honored to be with you all today. This is my first time at the Faraday Institute, and I've heard nothing but good things thus far. So thank you very much for having me, and thank you to those who have made this possible. I want to start with a story that many of you have probably heard in one form or another, but it's one that bears repeating. It's the story of Blaise Pascal, the 17th century French polymath who made significant contributions in mathematics, theology, philosophy, and physics. You might be most familiar with him through his infamous Pascal's wager, a perhaps cringeworthy philosophical argument that, all things being considered, you are better off betting your life on the claim that God does exist than that there is no God, because, quote, if you gain all. If you lose nothing. But there's much more to Pascal than this. Like so many of us, much of Pascal's work was autobiographical, driven by his own burning questions and demons. Pascal's first real sustained encounter with Christianity came in his early 20s, when his father broke his hip. Serious business in 17th century France. The two doctors who spent months at the Pascal home tending for the ailing father were Jansenists, radical Augustinians who engaged the young Pascal in friendship and conversation about faith. This resulted in an intellectual conversion of sorts in Pascal, but not one that gripped him in any particularly transformative way. After his father died in 1651, Pascal left behind any pursuit of God and entered his worldly period, which was followed by his younger sister leaving to join a convent. In other words, Pascal was left very much alone in the world, without his father, siblings, or God. He was also broke. And then something happened. After his death in 1662, he was only 39, a piece of paper was found sewn into his coat. It was dated 1654 and described an experience that the great thinker had found so profound that he carried his witness to it everywhere he went until he died. I'll read just a bit of this. This is the actual piece of paper that was found in his coat. The year of grace, 1654, Monday, 23rd November, from about 10:30 at night until about midnight, midnight, very specific timing. Fire. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and of the learned, certitude, feeling, joy, peace. Skipping on. Joy, 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 tears of joy. Eternally enjoy for a day's exercise on the earth, may I not forget your words. It was after this experience that Pascal turned more intensively to theology and philosophy, writing extensively about Christian belief and, crucially, the inability to believe. This man, who had experienced the most dramatic and life-changing mystical encounter, went on to write arguments for belief in God that feel, at times, like dry calculations devoid of any dynamic relationship with a God at all. So what is it that connects these two versions of Pascal? How do we connect the Pascal who writes on the one hand, let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is, and the Pascal who writes simply, fire? The key, I think, can be found in another Pascal quote. This is what he writes to those who want to believe, but do not. You would like to attain faith and do not know the way. You would like to cure yourself of unbelief and ask the remedy for it. Learn of those who have been bound like you and who now stake all their possessions. These are people who know the way which you would follow and who are cured of an ill of which you would be cured. Follow the way by which they began, by acting as if they believed, taking the holy water, having masses said, etc. Even this will naturally make you believe and deaden your acuteness. I highlight Pascal's story because it is extremely prescient. It foreshadows the growing body of scientific research, emphasizing the importance of both exceptional experience and habits and practices in contributing to the felt sense of God's reality and presence. I'm choosing my words very carefully here because words like belief, faith, and experience are loaded, theologically, philosophically, and scientifically. I'll make some distinctions as we go along, but first, my question today is simply this: can a human choose to believe in God? What would an answer to that question look like theologically, and what would it look like scientifically? My answer will be an ever-infuriating yes and no. No, given everything we know about the way human minds form beliefs, one cannot simply decide to believe in anything, God or otherwise. But that's not the whole story. One's religious belief is never a merely rational decision, but neither is belief some ephemeral phenomenon that occurs entirely outside of human agency. Rather, individuals wishing to embody a felt sense of religious belief might intentionally and appropriately self-direct the biological processes involved in both exceptional experiences and normal habit formation, in cooperation with pre-existent evolved cognitive dispositions and mechanisms that make belief thoroughly natural, thereby altering one's neurobiology and enhancing the organismic responsiveness necessary for a felt sense of belief. In other words, a person wishing to do so might indeed be able to choose belief in God, as I'll define it, albeit through a circuitous and indirect act of faith, choosing to pursue a route of acting or learning one's way into belief, and thereby making it neurobiologically likely that one will experience God as a felt reality. Religious belief is both a natural cognitive predisposition and also learned, using the same sorts of biological processes that allow for all belief formation. This allows significant scope in crafting religious habits and practices, aided by what I call spiritual technologies, which best facilitate brain change as it relates to a sense of God's presence. So what are my assumptions here? First, I assume that empirical mechanisms and theological claims are compatible with each other. I assume that it need not be theologically threatening to one's understanding of divine human interaction if we can identify how belief has evolved and occurs neurobiologically in a complex interplay of cognitive capacities, environment, culture, and experience. Secondly, and similarly, I assume for the sake of discussion that to be a physical being is not to be non-spiritual or uninvolved with God. I affirm an integrated physicality that sees the immensely complex, contextualized, embodied human organism as explanatorily and theologically sufficient, without recourse to an immaterial something more. Lastly, I'm assuming that if one affirms a participatory account of a God-nature relationship that emphasizes that all of nature is involved with God at all times, so rejecting the quasi-deistic model where we're constantly trying to find gaps in the causal order to slip God in, then to affirm human engagement with empirical spiritual technologies is theologically sound. Right, belief. What is belief? I'm going to follow Andrew Newberg's definition here, that belief refers to any perception, cognition, or emotion that the brain assumes, consciously or unconsciously, to be true. Belief is simply the perception of what is the case about reality. Cognitively, beliefs in general are useful heuristics or shortcuts that have evolved to aid us in navigating our environments. You'll notice that these definitions of belief are not at all specific to religious belief, but simply refer to the experience that something is the case. This is very basic and hopefully uncontroversial. The human capacity to believe things is not limited to religious belief. The upshot of all this is that when we're talking about belief that God is, we're basically talking about the perception that God is. neurobiologically speaking, belief is not propositional, but primarily embodied and felt. Scientifically, then, how are religious beliefs formed? Unsurprisingly, there is significant disagreement on this point. Religious belief is, of course, not something to be reduced to the empirical explanations on offer. Belief is complex, multimodal, contextualized, social, embodied, a product of culture and community and linguistic realities and narrative frameworks. I could go on. That being said, prominent explanations of belief formation are offered by cognitive science of religion on one hand and the neurosciences on the other. Cognitive science of religion, or CSR, as it's known, usually focuses on one of two explanations for the evolution of belief. The adaptation approach highlights the adaptive value of religious beliefs and behaviors, such as the pro-social actions stemming from a belief in an omniscient being. The byproduct approach, or the spandrel approach, is by far the dominant one in CSR. So who knows where this is for this picture? No, it's San Marco Basilica in Venice. The biologist and anthropologist Stephen Jay Gould is the person who kind of has helped make the spandrel theory in CSR very well known. And he got this idea, or he kind of formulated his idea when he was in this basilica in Venice. And he noticed the way that the spandrels of the cathedral, which is this kind of triangle part in the middle of the arches, he noticed the way that piece of the building is an architectural necessity, right, to keep the building up, right? So the particular sorts of arches and kind of like circles in the ceiling of the cathedral can only be supported if there are those spandrels there, right? But what happened? Artists came along and made a piece of art out of what was a structural necessity, right? So in a sense, the artwork is a byproduct of a structural feature that had to be there, okay? So that is the concept that's at play here in the byproduct approach. The spandrel model suggests that specifically religious beliefs are simply byproducts or subsets of the ability to form beliefs more broadly. Of course, the classic example here is the hypersensitive agency detection device, described by Pascal Boyer and also Justin Barrett, among others. The idea here is that if you're in a forest, you hear a noise behind you, it's in your best survival interest to attribute agency to a supposed dangerous predator and act accordingly. The cognitive disposition to see agency behind natural phenomena could have been one of the many natural mechanisms that led to the evolution of religious belief. And the story is much more complex than that, of course, but there is quite a bit of contemporary research to back this sort of thing up, suggesting that even children of atheists are intuitive theists, and that it takes a fair bit of work for humans to override the theistic predisposition. Justin Barrett, for instance, argues that specifically religious beliefs are a subset of evolved intuitive mental tools more generally, which we use to navigate our environment, attain knowledge, make informed decisions, etc. On the other hand, though, we have researchers studying the neurobiology of exceptional experiences. These are often called religious experiences, but I and many others find that term unhelpful, insofar as it suggests that exceptional experiences are always religious, or that they are somehow equated with being in a mystical trance state. It's not the case. The key here, though, is to note that there is something of a bipolar approach to religious belief, with CSR focusing on the completely ordinary, normal, evolved, predictable, unexceptional cognitive processes involved in belief on one hand, and neuroscientists examining precise neural correlates of particular intense experiences on the other. I spent this past summer with Justin Barrett at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California, working on some psychology and theology stuff. And he's very quick to say, oh, I'm a neuroskeptic. You're not going to learn anything but reductionistic mechanisms in those fMRIs. And then this past Saturday, I was speaking at an atheism conference, and I had a retired professor of psychiatry from Edinburgh come up to me and say, all that cognitive science, agency detection stuff is nonsense. I see what's really happening in my lab in an fMRI. So it's there's no love lost between these two camps. But for myself, I'm very comfortable combining these two approaches. Yes, of course, religious belief has an explicable, evolutionary story that has led humans to experience belief quite normally and naturally. At the same time, it's equally true that embodied, emotionally powerful, transcendent experiences of all sorts are an important part of the sticking power of belief. Immersive experiences make cognitive beliefs true to our embodied selves. The spiritual and psychological power of cathedrals bear witness to this, with all their smells and bells, even as we also accept that belief formation relies upon very normal, even mundane cognitive processes and rationalization. Both the ordinary and the exceptional need to be held in an appropriate tension. Of course, it's quite common these days for scholars and religious believers more broadly to downplay the role of religious experience, opting for a more responsible or grounded, less emotive emphasis on doctrine, discipline, social justice, etc. So my goal is not to downplay the role of sound thinking, just the opposite, really. My goal is to offer a corrective. We are inherently embodied creatures, and our philosophical and theological commitments are only enhanced by taking that reality seriously. Religious experience need not be dramatic. We're talking about a variety of experiences that exist on a very wide spectrum that are perceived by the individual as transcendent, inducing awe or peace, a felt sense of God's presence. Researcher Nina Azari and her colleagues have used PET scans, for example, to demonstrate that religious practitioners simply reciting spiritual texts experienced, like neurally, the perception of a relationship with God or the absolute, as if they were having a conversation with a human being in the room. It's significant that such studies involve not only individuals having dramatic experiences, but people exhibiting what we would all call relatively normal behaviors, reciting scripture, praying, that sort of thing. And the key here is that there's a strong link between exceptional experiences and habit, practice, normal rhythms of life. Relatively intense experiences are contextualized within patterns of habit. So when I talk about the science of exceptional experience and the science of belief formation, I'm talking about two sides of the same coin. Religious experience is impactful on the brain and our mental experience, and our habits and practices impact the likelihood and intensity of more exceptional experiences or a felt sense of God. So if then belief is embodied, felt, essentially perceptual, how might that perception, that holistic perception, be attained? Or more to the point, if a person, for whatever reason, has a desire and willingness to know a being that we would call God, then what? What's perhaps most interesting here is the growing body of research on brain plasticity, or neuroplasticity, which is a way overhyped term describing that it's something very simple, just the way that the function and the structure of the brain change in response to both mental and physical experiences. When different neurons are simultaneously activated consistently in response to given experiences, the synaptic connections between them literally strengthen. Put colloquially, I'm sure you've heard this, neurons that fire together wire together. When two experiences cause neurons to become consistently activated simultaneously over time, those experiences literally become wired more strongly in a path of least resistance, all in the name of neural efficiency. Moreover, these connections that result from experience can in turn affect cognitive beliefs. Experiences change the brain, and the brain in turn affects the way that we have future experiences. So this research is particularly promising because it takes physical processes very seriously, while still highlighting the necessity of personal agency to explain the reality of the circular processes involved. In short, neuroplasticity research marks a considerable shift in focus from reductionistic, locationalist views to more holistic, system-oriented perspectives on the body-brain environment nexus. It is thus one promising set of natural mechanisms by which real human agency might be enacted within the constraints of natural processes. And indeed, plasticity is essentially the neurological description of learning. As experiences alter neural networks, those altered networks in turn alter future cognition and behavior, demonstrating a sort of circular causation. The brain changes chemically and structurally in response to both informal experiences and specific training. Humans are constantly in a state of learning and neural change, and as theologian Joel Green articulates, This constant becoming is encoded in our brains by means of synaptic activity, as both nature and nurture yield the same effect, namely, sculpting the brain and thus shaping the mind in ways that form and reform the developing self. So what does this look like in specific human populations? Many of you will have heard of one of the seminal brain plasticity studies on London taxi drivers. In this study, licensed London drivers who are required to go through very, very rigorous spatial and navigational training and testing. I've since learned that this is called the knowledge. They had their brains compared with normal drivers. What's amazing is that the taxi driver's posterior hippocampi, which is just a part of the brain that's responsible for spatial orientation, was significantly larger than those of the control groups. And this part of the brain grew in correlation with the amount of time that the person had been a taxi driver. And we're talking actual weight of brain matter here. The brain actually grew in mass. So this and many other studies demonstrate that highly specific ways in which plasticity operates in normal human brains on a daily basis with no pre-existent intention or even awareness on the part of the individual involved. It's very normal. What does this have to do with God? Much, as it turns out. There are certain conditions that contribute to more significant neural changes. By increasing the intensity of one or another factor, we can, to some degree, change the resulting experience. So there are many factors. 3 that are particularly emphasized, though, are attention, repetition, and emotional salience. So attention. While the precise mechanism by which the mind influences the brain remains a mystery, there is a wide range of evidence indicating that focused attention is arguably the most significant factor in changes in the brain. So merely pairing stimuli isn't really enough to create a long-term brain change. You need to actually be focusing on something. Then there's repetition. Repetition, or automaticity, is another particularly vital element for long-term brain change. This is perhaps self-evident. It's common sense that the brain changes accompanying learned skills like playing an instrument, performing an athletic action, or navigating city streets would increase over time and with practice. And indeed, as individuals consistently choose particular actions, the brain forms new connections that strengthen, quite literally, into the path of least resistance. And in this way, actions that initially required volitional effort eventually become automatized. This is also why forming new habits is forming small new habits is really the way to have long-term change in any area of your life, because you need to take the effort out of it, right? The key is to make a habit formed so that you're not trying to do a good thing every time you do the good thing, right? It needs to become quite natural to you. And finally, emotional engagement. Emotional salience seems to lead to greater neural change than repetitive behaviors lacking a meaningful sense of emotional engagement. The importance of emotion for learning may even seem self-evident. Humans learn very quickly to avoid situations and behaviors associated with negative emotion and to gravitate toward those associated with positive emotion. And this is actually partially the way that habits are formed. In fact, it seems that many of the structural brain changes involved in addiction, which is brain plasticity's dark side, are linked to the neurochemical rewards induced by the drug. So positive emotional states are very significant facilitators of long-term brain change because they contribute to us continuing the habit over and over and over again, triggering lasting changes in the brain's structure and function that in turn alter our perception. So the amazing thing is that this process can be self-directed. Given that brain change is occurring regardless of one's awareness of it, cognitive activity can thus be observed and changed in accordance with one's selected goals. Again, this is just learning. Anytime you decide to learn something new, this is exactly what you're doing. Brain change is dependent on the frequency and intensity of exposure to various stimuli. And so by intentionally altering these variables, you can act in a top-down manner to affect long-term change. Again, learning. Connecting this to belief then. if an individual considers religious belief to be a desirable goal, the volitional higher level processes involved in your holistic self can self-direct the lower level processes involved to pursue those behaviors most likely to result in the attainment of said goal. So the real issue here is not one of choosing belief, but rather learning belief and putting yourself in these sorts of situations and experiences that are most conducive to the thing that you're trying to experience or move towards. So let's first look at, within a religious context, attention. In a great many religious practices, including many forms of meditation, prayer, liturgy, and communal worship, the individual begins by directing his or her attention toward a specific spiritual goal or purpose, communion with God, oneness with the universe, etc. And as discussed, research would anticipate that if such focused mental activity were to initiate brain change, attention areas of the brain, namely the frontal lobes, should be activated during this activity. And indeed, this has been the case. Religious practitioners engaged in prayer or meditation exhibit elevated activity levels in the frontal lobes, which have been demonstrated to play vital roles in the alteration of neural pathways involving memory and language, and also the processing of religious beliefs. Spiritual practices that require high levels of attention and focus have been repeatedly demonstrated to affect long-term brain changes in practitioners, resulting in significant enhancements in memory and overall cognitive functioning. And it's not only brain function that changes with focused attention in spiritual practices, but the structure of the brain itself. The middle prefrontal regions of mindfulness meditation practitioners is actually thicker. But do such brain changes actually correspond to increased levels of belief? After all, there are plenty of expert meditators who do not believe in God. On one hand, it does actually seem fair to say that individuals tend to believe in and even perceive what they intentionally focus on. There's a lot of evidence to back this up, that what we focus on becomes more real to us. When you intensely meditate on a specific goal over an extended period of time, your brain begins to relate to your idea as if it were an actual object in the world by increasing activity in the thalamus, part of the reality-making process of the brain. And that research is also from Andrew Newberg. So focused attention itself will not change beliefs. These practices also need to be engaged in repetitively in a religious context. And this happens most usually in the form of ritual. So of course, repetition is a vital part of ritual. And religious ritual is arguably one of the most significant factors in the formation of religious belief, and actually seems to generate belief within participants over time. So ritual is a very complex subject studied by various disciplines. It can be defined in various ways, but it's generally considered to indicate structured patterns of repetitive behavior that recur regularly and often involve rhythm, symbolism, and a communally acknowledged formality. Such rituals, be they prayer, chants, dances, or meditation sessions, serve to synchronize affective, perceptual, and motor processes within the central nervous system. Rituals involving rhythm and music tend to be particularly effective in producing neurophysiological effects that cause participants to experience altered states of consciousness, and in some contexts, experiences they subsequently deem very spiritual. Unfortunately, it's extremely difficult to study the neurological effects of ritual. Of course, different rituals affect different parts of the brain in very different ways, and it's difficult to tease apart the causal elements here of ritual. Is the emotional intensity creating a felt experience of God, or the amount of times a prayer is repeated, or the group setting? What's going on? Nevertheless, we can say that there seems to be a strong correlation between felt religious belief and repetitive religious behavior. It's likely that the cognitive and communal context of ritual helps generate belief as well. Rituals do not exist as standalone techniques, but are situated within religious contexts and communities. This goes beyond merely altering neural firing patterns. These are cognitively structured by the community and context in which they occur. Religious abstractions become neurally linked repeatedly with the whole body experience of the participant in a very particular culture and context that has a multi-layered meaning system and causal factors going on. But the role of ritual really is to teach religious concepts to the participants' bodies, by turning doctrinal abstractions into felt experiences to mind, body, sensory, and cognitive events that prove their reality to those involved. As William James neatly summarizes, truth happens to an idea. It becomes true, is made true by events. And finally, we have emotional arousal. Emotional arousal plays a vital role in the formation of belief, as it does in learning more broadly. This brings us back to exceptional experiences. Beliefs are integrally tied to embodied experiences, and the more gripping and multifaceted the experience, the stronger the felt sense of belief. There are many facets to understanding what's happening in religious experiences, and the neurobiology of such experiences is still very poorly understood. But they do seem to involve an emotional arousal that enhances or even engenders the felt reality of spiritual entities. Though the idea of religious experience can seem exceedingly disagreeable to modern sensibilities, such experiences fall on a very wide spectrum, ranging from the barely perceptible, in terms of neuroimaging, experiences of beauty and awe, to the full-on mystical states sometimes experienced in meditation or psychedelic experiences. There's actually quite a lot of interesting contemporary research on psychedelics in the way that the very, very long-term effects, spiritual effects actually, and emotional and mental health effects that appropriate psychedelic use can have in people's lives. It's fascinating. Most religious experiences actually seem to be analogs of ordinary emotions like awe, love, joy, fear, etc. The difference lies in their being directed toward a religious object. Though, of course, there are marked differences in the content and context of these experiences across cultures and religions, a common thread running through them seems to be that religious experiences are felt by the individual to be as real or even more real than everyday baseline experiences. Moreover, emotional experiences heavily influence one's beliefs in general, uniting thoughts with a felt sense that the thoughts represent reality. So again, though religious experiences vary in content, neural substrates, and methods of induction, they all provide the individual with a visceral experience powerful enough to convert mere ideas and doctrine into felt belief and embodied myth. Though the importance of understanding cultural and religious distinctives can't be emphasized enough, it's still possible to identify certain cross-cultural technologies of spiritual experience. Research into religious experience has focused on various aspects, ranging from altered states of consciousness, the correlation of a felt presence of God with activity in the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain, and using brain scans to identify both the cognitive and emotional substrates involved. Sometimes these experiences contain components like visions, a sense of oneness with the universe, a loss of bodily boundaries, including loss of bodily boundaries. But more often than not, they're accompanied by more subtle, vague aspects like feelings of joy or awe, love, an overall sense of being in relationship to the divine. The actual mechanisms for inducing intense experiences involve such varied elements as rhythm, music, prayer, meditation, fasting, chanting, psychedelics. It seems that a wide range of such religious rituals actually increase neuronal firing rates, thereby serving to create a conditioned association of evoked emotions with specific cognitive schema. Again, William James, so ahead of his time, summarizes the salient point here, namely that religious experiences seem to those who experience them to be also states of knowledge. As a rule, they carry with them a curious sense of authority, even after the experience has passed. These experiences need not be dramatic. The key is that they are actual events that are felt as real in the brain. It would seem then that through the alteration of such factors as attention, repetition, and emotion, beliefs are essentially learned. And as previously discussed, experience-dependent plasticity seems to be a mechanism by which such learning occurs. There is something deeply pragmatic about belief formation. Just as learning a new word changes you, so does religious activity change you. It should be emphasized that dramatic experiences need not be frequent in order for belief to develop. On the contrary, belief seems to work best within the daily structural framework of religious habit and ritual, only occasionally being punctuated by more emotional experiences. Through standard learning processes, as well as classical and contextual conditioning, the objects, places, and beliefs of normal religious ritual are invested with emotional significance. Belief thus seems to occur in a holistic learning environment that includes affective experience, embodied ongoing rituals, and a communal religious context that supplies the actual content. Beliefs, experiences, rituals, and neural pathways are thus interlocking and mutually reinforcing. Doctrine alone is not enough to engender belief out of whole cloth when our perception actively assures us of its opposite. That's a quote from William James as well. Religious belief is, neurologically speaking, a type of knowledge insofar as it is engendered and grows through the mechanisms of learning. To the extent that this knowledge is similar to other learned habits and behaviors, it's necessarily embodied in the brain. As Ian Barber has emphasized, just as we use the skills of knowing how, rather than the propositions of knowing that, to learn to ride bicycles, so is religious belief inculcated through interaction with our physical environments and other people. Proposition alone is unlikely to give rise to religious beliefs, for without bodily engagement with ritual, practice, and experience in general, religious beliefs lack both emotional salience and motivational force. Abstractions might amplify, define, and contextualize the felt conviction of God, but are highly unlikely to engender it in the first place. And the idea of intentionally cultivating belief via the brain's normal processes of habit and learning, being involved in religious practices, is not a new concept. Indeed, Hindus, Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, Jews all have done so in very methodical ways, recognizing that volitional choice can act in top-down ways to engage the body and mind and behaviors that engender and strengthen belief. Perhaps ironically, actually, mystics around the world religions have often stressed the completely attainable and non-mysterious nature of belief and religious experiences with God. Engaging in religious behaviors in order to inculcate a felt sense of belief is not always effective, but when it is effective, the effects are long-lasting and transformative. It's plausible that when people are able to combine affective religious engagement with the right sorts of rituals and behaviors consistently and over time, both the associated religious content and the felt reality of that content become virtually encoded within the body itself. Indeed, it's no coincidence that many of the behaviors demonstrated to affect long-term brain change particularly well are also particularly important in existing religious communities. It's fascinating, actually, how they've hit on this. These practices include prayer, meditation, hymn singing, musical engagement, incense, yoga, etc. All these are aesthetically immersive and involve focus, repetition. They're emotionally engaging. The factors leading to greater brain change are also involved in practices correlated with a strong sense of belief. Religious practices and belief are part of a reciprocal relationship. People engage in the practices in such a way that their emotions and attentions change and strengthen the brain's pathways. And that felt sense of belief and encounter with something felt as real, in turn encourages future practices. You felt as if you've connected with something, you're more likely to do it in the future. And indeed, when a positive intellectual content is associated with a faith state, it gets invincibly stamped in upon belief, and this explains the passionate loyalty of religious persons everywhere to the minutest details of their so widely differing creeds. Another quote from James. In the words of William James once more, I promise I'll stop quoting him soon, I doubt if dispassionate intellectual contemplation of the universe would ever have resulted in religious philosophies such as we now possess. It is worth mentioning that such self-directed plasticity has essentially found theological justification throughout church history as well. The admonition to act as if one believed in order to eventually feel that belief has been expressed in many times and places. And now we're just hearing that there is also scientific justification for what religious systems have already intuitively grasped. Is what they've been doing all along, providing contextualized practices, supports, and spiritual technologies by which individuals might encounter their respective objects of worship. So in closing, I have to end with I'll end by addressing the manipulation question, which is of course, the first question that always comes up when we're talking about this. Isn't all of this a manipulation? Am I advocating that people brainwash themselves into believing something that may or may not be true? Here, I'd want to make a distinction between a belief state, which is a cognitive thing, and faith. I'm particularly compelled by Jonathan Van Vig's work on faith without belief, actually. Some very interesting arguments there. Can you have faith without belief? He would say yes. So would Daniel Howard Snyder. He defines faith in the following way. Faith is an orientation of a person toward a longer-term goal. An orientation or disposition toward the retaining of the goal or plan or project in the face of difficulties in achieving it. One prompted by affections of various sorts and involving complex mental states that are fundamentally affective, even if they involve cognitive dimensions as well. A plan, purpose, or goal is developed, and the culmination of this process involves a commitment by the individual to such a plan, and in following through on such a commitment, the person displays the kind of faith that I am describing. Our brains and minds are changing every time we walk out the front door in the morning. We all choose to allow ourselves to be changed, manipulated, if you will, by placing ourselves in contexts that have the ability to change and transform us. We invite manipulation every time we go to a concert, a museum, a church, fall in love, have alcohol. Our environments and habits change us. They just do. We don't have an option in that. The suggestion here has simply been that if one's decision of doubtful desire and doubtful faith prompts one to seek belief, there are ways to make that faith-driven goal a potential reality. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. We've got plenty of time for some questions, and I can see a few hands springing up immediately. Dennis was the first with his hand up over there, and then we'll move across to the other end of that row and then come further forward.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question. You started out with a definition from Andrew Neuberg, which is a definition of belief that the brain assumes various things to be true. And you thought that this was non-controversial. I didn't like the definition, and simply because I think it's, brains in vats don't have beliefs. And I just thought his ascribing agency, the agent is not the brain, the agent is the person who has beliefs. Yeah. And really your whole seminar has illustrated that. So I was wondering why you were so rather approved of that definition. I thought it was a rather bad definition myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am perhaps being overly generous to Neuberg and attributing to him an understanding of the brain as necessarily involving interaction with the whole body and that body's environment. I think if you were to get him alone in a room, he would acknowledge that embodied cognition is definitely what's happening, and that you can't have, like, a brain in a vat is not going to have a belief. He's a neuroscientist, so he talks in terms of belief states. If I were to change his definition, and I agree with you, I would change his definition to say, not that it's the brain's perception of what is true, but it is what the embodied organism, what the human organism perceives to be true. It doesn't require you to have any sort of particular philosophy of mind, I don't think. I think we can just say that this person right here perceives something to be true. He's going to use brain language for it. I'm probably being a little bit overly generous in assuming that he would understand that doesn't mean a brain in a vat.
Yes, the hand there just gone up down the end of the way. There we go. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. I enjoyed it. My question is about what I've seen and heard since I've been in this room. First thing I've done is hear a very good presentation. I'd like to thank you for it. Secondly, I've been thinking about contemporary context, the context within which your presentation has been developed or been presented. I'm also thinking about culture, a clash of culture. Right now in November, talk about context first. Right now in November 2019, this country is a divided country. In terms of clash of culture, your own specialism is one of the intersection between religion and science. So your match with this particular group is very, very close. Mm-hmm. I took from the first part of your presentation the picture of a two-sided coin, that in fact you can look at the same thing from two different perspectives and recognize that it's the same thing. And from that, given that you are from Scotland and you're in England right now, given that your presentation contained quite a lot of pictures of religion in history in Europe, and our society is very different to that now. It's a secular society. Given, I don't want to be personal, but I will be, given that you are American and you are in England, well, Canadian, I feel much warmer towards you now. Given that you're Canadian and that you're operating in England, given that North America is more religious than the United Kingdom and Europe, which is increasingly secular, can I ask you, having been refreshed by focused attention, ritual, and the other one, which I've completely forgotten,
emotional salience,
and being manipulated, how should the Christian operate in this modern secular society in November 2019 to make a difference?
Okay. Right. I mean, and to be honest, I am an American in a very divided UK, but my own country is also one of the most divided places in the Western world right now as well. And so I understand what you're talking about. Wow. Connecting this to wider cultures is difficult, but I work a lot outside of church contexts. I am particularly compelled. Again, I'm compelled by people who do not experience a traditional sense of religious belief. That is a group of people, cohort, that I find very refreshing and honest. And but I also see among them a real desire for transcendence, for something more, for meaning, for purpose. And what we see is that people are still seeking the same things. People are still seeking the same sorts of connection to something creative and deep, powerful, all-consuming. There are a lot of adjectives I could use here. It's not that people have stopped looking for this. It's just that they're looking for it in different places. I feel like I can criticize the Church of Scotland here for a moment because I am in the Church of Scotland. And I will be the first to say that we have some work to do. We have basically taken everything we know about how churches should be facilitating immersive encounters with God for people, and they've stripped away much of what would help facilitate those sorts of experiences. And, that's a long conversation that we could have. But, you go to a sporting event, you go to a concert, you see people exhibiting many of the same sorts of reactions as historically they would have in churches, and as honestly they still do in the developing world, right? So the fastest growing churches in the world are Pentecostal charismatic churches in the global south. Churches that are in decline, mainline churches in places like the US and the UK. And there are reasons for that. It makes complete sense to me. I'm not, and so we could have a long conversation about ways that Christians could join people where they are, like biologically as well as culturally and socially. But I think it's a fallacy to think that people are not still, there's sort of a myth of secularity, right? So we think, oh, well, there's religious and they're secular, and if you're not in a church, then you're secular. People are still seeking spirituality. Absolutely. They're just not looking for it in traditional packages. And I think that's an interesting conversation to have.
Thank you. Come forward just here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your talk. Another American accent here. Set to annoy the room. I was thinking about a number of things. I mean, I think there's an interesting question about the collapse of belief in Protestant societies, which very much connects with what you're saying about ritual and embodied practices of various kinds. I'm especially interested, though, in the question of what we might consider long-term atheism or agnosticism among those who consciously engage in religious practices. And this has become an interest to me ever since I was ordained. And I meet people who are outwardly quite religious, but inwardly they express a lot of different doubts And, they're kind of still trying to engage with things, but they just find year on year it's not sort of landing. And it feels like it's a fairly small percentage who are in that particular niche, but I wonder if your research has touched on that a bit.
Yeah. Well, see, what you're getting at is the multidimensionality of religious behavior and belief. So, I mean, traditionally, and especially here in the UK still, for certain people, the church is not just about connecting them to God. It's performing a really vital social role, right? So if you if your main connections with other people, your deepest connections with other people are happening in the church, for example, then it's no surprise that you would be kind of very religious on the outside to be part of that group. Group dynamics have a way of encouraging you to do behaviors that you wouldn't otherwise do, right? So we become more religious if our friends are religious. This just happens, or outwardly religious. But on the same token, though, I mean, I think it's Dawkins, right, who talks about going to cathedrals to the choral evensong or something, just because it feels transcendent to him. It is just neurobiologically predictable that people would be drawn to otherworldly, non-ordinary experiences. And actually, that's a big part of the sorts of exceptional experiences that I've been talking about. How you have one of the key aspects of successful, and I'm talking very clinically and reductionistically, so forgive me, but one of the key aspects of successful sort of religious communal experiences is that they don't feel anything like your normal life, right? So in some ways, I mean, there's a lot we can say about the Protestant Reformation, but the subsequent stripping, in Scotland we call it the stripping of the altar, and the subsequent stripping of all the aesthetic immersive kind of qualities of a church building, for example, taking away organs, taking away icons, and anything that would make our physical environment feel transcendent and feel different than how we feel when we walk out the front door. That was a huge mistake, right? So if you walk off the street these days and you walk into a church with whitewashed walls, clear windows, nothing's happening, there's wood pews, and it's just there's nothing to distinguish that context from a classroom other than sort of the doctrine coming out of your mouth. That's not going to help. So I think that oftentimes people are being connected to something that is emotively effective for them. They're feeling some sort of transcendence, even if they don't have any sort of religious belief stamped onto it. My partner's a minister in the Church of Scotland, and he'll come home and tell me this all the time. He's like, yeah, half my parishioners don't even actually, well, he doesn't say that. Don't quote me on that. But he has said, I suspect that many people that attend church are doing so for reasons that don't have anything to do with whether or not they believe in a physical resurrection of Christ, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Can I ask you, if belief is self-reinforcing, is unbelief equally self-reinforcing? Yeah, so there are many cognitive biases that we have, right? So human beings as organisms just don't like to be wrong. So we have sort of an inertia, a cognitive inertia toward not admitting that we are wrong about something. So if we are if we're habitual atheists, then we have a cognitive bias towards staying that way. In the same way that if you are growing up in a religious family, you're much more likely to own that belief as yours. Come down to a hand here, and then across the other side. Do you want one? Let's play. And then across here, and then we'll see how much time we've got. To be brief with a question.
Thanks for the talk. So I want to ask you a question. So yesterday I heard a lecture by Rowan Williams on Teresa of Avila, and she talks about the fact that when you get to the when you enter spiritual maturity, what happens is that everything that you do, washing up, becomes formative. Yeah. So I want to ask you, so basically the point is that when you are someone who is spiritually not well formed, you need particular kind of experiences, and what Sarah's presented is very helpful for understanding how that works. But she also teaches that when you ascend into spiritual maturity, for a certain kind of people like that, every kind of physical experience will become a belief reinforcing kind of experience. That means every experience becomes an exceptional experience. Yeah. So I want to ask whether there's any kind of research that verifies this kind of thing.
Yeah, so this is the ecstasy of St. Teresa. Right, yes. So I'm going to... the best research on this comes from research on psychedelics, right? What we find is that people who have supervised psychedelic sessions meant to sort of lead to some sort of spiritual transformation or personal growth or whatever, people who have extremely meaningful experiences on these psychedelic-induced states of consciousness go on to have long-term permanent changes in their perception of reality, right? And in fact, there's this joke amongst researchers in this area that psychedelics are a gateway drug to meditation because people who have only one experience on psychedelics, okay, so we'll call that sort of the exceptional experience. People who have like one exceptional experience will go on to never really feel the need for another sort of psychedelic experience, but they change everything else about their lives. They perceive the world as being inherently kinder and more loving. They have different sorts of relationships with their loved ones. Their fear of death oftentimes will become significantly diminished or go away altogether. And so what we see is that when you have these kind of one-off or very occasional, more intense experiences, it tends to change the way you perceive reality afterwards. And there are actually reasons for that. So the current research, Imperial College London actually is doing a lot on this right now, like this year, that when you have an exceptional experience of the kind that radically kind of like shakes up your brain. Imagine a snow globe, right? It's like what happens is it very profoundly disrupts what we call the default mode network, which is sort of like this very rigid, like low grade, like threat detection, like activation pattern in your head, which makes you kind of constantly ruminate on what might go wrong, that kind of thing. It radically disrupts that, and it actually allows for new neural connections to be made after these transformative experiences. And so it's like it radically shifts your perception of reality. And if you then encourage that change, you have more freedom to become the person that you want to be, or to believe what you want to believe, or to see the world in the way that you want to see it. Yeah, so there is some, but it's usually in psychedelics.
Thank you. I'll take one last question, probably over here.
Thank you for the talk. I was actually kind of curious about something that you said early on about the sort of interaction with God and the world and how you understand that,
Yeah.
and how that actually connects to this sort of question of religious experiences. Can we turn this around and look at what's common between all different religious experiences to try to figure out what God's trying to relate to us, and what sort of ideally propositional content do you think there is there?
That's good, yeah. I wrote about this a lot in I have a book that just came out with CUP, with Cambridge University Press, called Divine Action in the Human Mind. And in that book, I go through the problems with traditional conceptions of the God-world model. How we usually think of basically a quasi-deistic model, where we've got God over here and the natural world over here. We're trying to get God in constantly. And so I explore different models like panentheism, more robust versions of theism like Thomism, or pneumatology actually has a lot to offer to this question. I think, if anything, I would say that I don't want to say what's common to all religions, but I will say, like, what seems likely to me is that if I'm going to speak put my theologian hat on, I would say that there is something about interconnectedness, relationality, connection, and yeah, that is vitally important. And embodiment, actually, embodiment, connection, interdependence, yeah. So those are features of any sort of theological framework that I would affirm.
Great, thank you very much. I think we're going to have to draw things to a close at that point. Thank you ever so much. Like it or not, our neural connections have been altered in one way or another during the past hour. So thank you ever so much for doing that.
Thank you. Thank you.